Hello and welcome to the Polish Economic Institute event where we show the results of our recent report about the secure gas supplies for the winters to come and the European path from crisis to independence. After the presentation of the report, we will have a debate with our dear panelists that I wanted now to introduce. The presentation about the report will be prepared by Kamil Lipiński, who is a senior analyst at the Polish Economic Institute. Hello, Kamil.
Good morning, everyone.
And then we have the next guest, Ben McWilliams, who is affiliate fellow in the field of energy and climate policy at Bruegel.
Hi, good morning. Thanks for the invite.
Last but not least, there is also Kacper Żeromski, Deputy Director, System Development at European Network of Transmission System Operators for Gas, which is ENTSOG. Hello, Kacper.
Hello, good morning. Pleasure to be here.
Now we can proceed with further steps for this event, which is the presentation of this report. Kamil, you can start showing your slides.
Why we decided to go on with this topic? Basically, as we've observed for last 6 months, the situation after Russia cutting off most of the supplies to Europe have basically stabilized. Many journalists have announced the success and the return of the low gas prices. However, quite recently, as we've observed, we might be stable right now, but we remain fragile. The interruptions in the functioning of critical infrastructures are extremely impactful on the gas prices. So basically, the idea behind our report was to understand, to allow broader audiences, not only narrow group of experts, but broader audiences to understand what has happened and why. So we basically ask ourselves and try to answer the 3 basic questions. First, how did we get here? In most of the think tanks and public institutions, you don't have that much time to ask that question, but it's really important. We have to remember that the crisis did not start in 2022 with the invasion. The foundations of it were quite before that. Were established quite before that. Secondly, what has happened? Which policies worked, which did not? It's good to take sometimes the step back in the recent past or the present and analyze which approaches are efficient and which are less efficient. Thirdly, as we can have observed from ENTSOG summer outlook with winter perspective, the situation in the case of cutting of Russian supplies or critical conditions like cold spell can be challenging. So the idea was to analyze to whom which countries would be potentially most affected and what can be done, and to what extent the solidarity and cooperation between member states should be encouraged. So basically, we focus not on European Union as whole most of the time, but on GAS7 countries. Why? Because they cover most of infrastructure, most of consumption, and most of storage capacity. Therefore, their political decisions within their competences heavily impact the situation on the gas market. And their responsibility for the crisis is therefore proportionally high. When we look back, we can see that the crisis was far ahead. In 2014, with the ENTSO-G, asked by European Commission, prepared materials that showed that the cutting of Russian supplies would have serious impact on the security of supply of several European countries. However, despite that, not a lot was done in the aspect of decoupling from Russian gas. Quite on the contrary, the amount of gas imported increased in between 2014 and 2021. It was caused basically by decrease of European production and increase in gas consumption. So we can say that on the top of that, the production of gas increased in most critical, the consumption of gas increased in most critical aspects. So firstly, solidarity protected customers, households, essential social services, and also heating facilities. They became more and more important group of consumers. The households and critical gas-fired power plants were one of the most increasing. The consumption increased a lot in that aspect. So it was not only the amount of gas consumed, it was also the structure of gas consumption that affected the EU security. If we in our report we analyze several policies of GAS7 countries, we can see that a lot of could have been done. We could have avoid the increase of gas consumption in power sector. We could have diversified more. We could have built additional pipelines to import gas from outside the EU. But most of the countries did not done most of those things. Some of the countries like France, Poland, done quite a few of them, but still the broader picture of what was done and the effects of it were not enough. As a result, we've observed in 2022 the revolution of gas in the market of gas market. Firstly, the flows have reversed from direction from east to west, from northwest to southeast. On the top of that, the structure of relations on the gas market has changed as well. So the correlations between different market areas have changed. The impact of Henry Hub prices on the European market, for example, TTF, PEG, PSV, and PVB have greatly increased, while the Russian benchmarks became less correlated with the prices on the gas market. What saved us? We had to replace over 900 terawatt hours of Russian gas. It was mainly done thanks to LNG imports. And that covered about diversification, covered about 46%. Without increased imports of LNG, the reduction could have been over 80% higher. But we remember from the beginning of last year, from International Energy Agency, European Commission, some outlooks. And if we also Polish Economic Institute done some of them, we could have observed that the reduction exceed the expectations. So it's from one hand side, it tells us something about the relative elasticity of flexibility of the European gas market. On the other hand, the substitution that was expected from non-renewable and renewable energy sources was not quite, because of the weather extreme drought, because of the problems with nuclear generation, because of the nuclear phase out, did not quite help the reduction as expected. We are on the long way outside from the crisis. Like basically next 2-3 years, if we analyze the projects, the amount of capacity of LNG terminals will double in the next 5 years. So it basically will provide enough supplies to cover it. However, if we analyze all the projects, the question remains: Are we safe? Firstly, are we safe already? And to what extent are all the projects necessary and economically viable? We've analyzed several scenarios. Basically, the results and outcomes of our analysis is that for Central and Eastern Europe, the isolation and harsh competition between different market players is extremely dangerous from the security of from the adequacy perspective. So basically, if the countries do not cooperate in the if only the market power, which was modeled in our simulations by the amount of gas consumed, if the market power decides who gets the gas, it's even for the big players like Italy and Germany, it's not really beneficial because we need the gas 7 countries are creating the system. So basically, what we have proposed, that it's quite an addition to what is proposed by European Commission, the 15% reduction. We've estimated that during the winter time, about 9% reduction would be sufficient if the countries would share the burden efficiently. What does it mean? If they share also the storages. So if, for example, storages in one country are used to fill the storages in another country. In our simulations, the solidarity mechanism, so the additional measures, legal measures to supply the solidarity protected customers most vulnerable, such as households and essential social services, were not necessary if the storages are full, which is in accordance to Commission. However, given the recent circumstances, we can expect quite other scenario that is, I would say, quite unique for our report. So we've analyzed to what extent, how big the interruptions can be. So it's not only about n-1, as in most of infrastructure analysis. It was analysis how much can we lose in case, for example, of hybrid attack on energy and gas infrastructure. The results show that gas 7 countries quite differ from each other in the aspect of this system redundancy. And while in regular scenarios, no hybrid scenarios, the German storages are quite a challenge for all the cooperation between gas 7 countries and European Union, because they need to be we need to cooperate to meet that filling targets. However, in case of hybrid attack, it's most important. Basically, it's one of the most essential parts of the European Union from the security of supply perspective. So the cooperation in the North Sea Basin to protect the most essential European infrastructure remains a potential issue. We observed that, and it's also in line with observations of ENTSO-G, that a lot of remains to be done still next 2-3 years. So basically, some reduction on average 9-10% during the summer period is strongly recommended for gas 7 countries to meet the filling targets. On the other hand, the market mechanism, which were quite challenged last year and this year, have proven to be very effective reduction incentives. So our main recommendation is not to meddle too much with that. So basically, we've managed to survive the last winter, but it was quite warm winter, and the Russian supplies were not fully interrupted. However, it's still a possibility, and we need to be prepared for wars. Therefore, the market remains very important in that model. Secondly, as the storage, the gas storages remain essential part of security of security of supply of the gas system and energy infrastructure. Not only the the European security of supply system is based on minimum security requirements, and those minimum security requirements are quite realistic model to have some common indicator and then enforce it. So there is an indicator filling target for member states, but we propose another filling indicator, that another minimum security requirement, the minimum storage level at the end. That would be that was suggested, but it's not legally enforced, and it would greatly increase the security of the system. Secondly, we have to monitor more in many countries that are during the energy process of energy transition, the gas consumption of most critical the critical gas power plants. In many of preventive action plans, the consumption of those critical gas fired power plants were not really that precisely estimated, and the modeling it becomes more and more important aspect of cooperation between ENTSO-E and ENTSO-G. Our analysis, but also the experiences of 2022, have proven definitely that the solidarity is extremely important aspect, and not only during the problems with supplying the solidarity protected customers, but also in development of the infrastructure and planning the energy policies. Also, the countries should have cooperated. We've marked on this map the infrastructure that is most essential for gas security of Europe and gas 7 countries, and we can observe that it's quite concentrated geographically. So there is a potential for cooperation between countries on that matter. We've identified several bottlenecks, and for an energy expert, it might be not that much surprising the potential. But without those bottlenecks, the reduction would be not that much necessary. Without those those bottlenecks wouldn't be an issue, we would only need only 5% of reduction. So basically, the question remains open: to what extent should we challenge those bottlenecks if the development of LNG floating storage regasification units will probably resolve most of the gas adequacy and the security of supply issue in next 5 years. And lastly, who should pay for it? As we've identified, the policies of gas 7 member states greatly impacted the security of supply of the system. So, to what extent the recompensations, financial transfers are necessary to cover the security of supply actions that are impactful not only for member state, but also to all the member states and all European Union as whole. Thank you very much, and I recommend to download the report from site of Polish Economic Institute.
Thank you so much, Kamil, for your very interesting presentation of the report. Now I wanted to give one information to our audience. If you would like to ask any question, you can do it by writing it in a comment. And when we have time at the end of our debate, we'll try to answer your questions. But firstly, I would like to ask our participants, panelists, if you have any comments about the presentations of Kamil. Do you agree or strongly disagree with something what was presented? If not, we can proceed with the questions, because I have a few of them. I would like to deep further with some topics. And firstly, I I wanted to ask Kacper, what in ENSOC opinion is currently the risk related to security of gas supply for the next winter, the following winter, and what is the risk of the safety for the next winters? Do you think that the EU will still need Russian gas supplies? And what should be done in case of any gas demand curtailment?
Thank you very much. Let me then at first congratulate on the report. Very insightful, very good recommendations that are concluded there. I think we share that in ENSOC. That's basically what is coming from our report. As it was mentioned by Kamil, ENSOC published its summer supply outlook this time together with winter overview. So we are tweaking our format to fit more, I would say, interest of the audience at the moment. We are transmission system operators organization, and we look at the situation from the transmission system perspective. That's why normally what we were investigating in the past in our outlooks and how where focus was if Europe is able to satisfy its demand with given supply and during summer to inject enough gas to the storages and then during winter to use it, I would say smartly and then to satisfy the demand itself. And then the question for the next winter is still valid, whether Europe would be able to do it. What we seen in our simulations, this summer shouldn't be a problem in terms of injecting. We started with very confident 55% of the gas storage on your average level. That gives very good chances and opportunities. Now we are more than 75%. I don't recall exact number, but we are very high in terms of the injecting to the storages. So this summer should be okay. But then, as you mentioned, as Kamil mentioned as well in the report, next winter is a question mark whether we would be still able to do it. The thing is that satisfying demand is one side of the coin. Other is as well to be able to still keep some significant storage level at the end of winter season. Why? Because European gas storages works in a way that further you deplete them, then the pressure drops, and then withdrawal capacity is then decreased. So keeping, I would say, target 30%, that's what we as well usually investigate, allows to have around 50% in the European gas storages in those very cold winter months, so January, February, and then it gives an opportunity to use maximum of the withdrawal capacities. That's a question, and that's a challenge for the next winter, to use storages smartly at the, I would say, last resort. And as I said, I'm speaking from the European transmission system operator perspective. There is a market factor in all the picture, and that was well addressed by Kamil in his report. But not only satisfying demand, but as well not using what is in the storages fully. That should be a goal, because then if this summer would be starting not from the very comfortable 55%, but we would be starting from fully depleted storages, then we would be seeing a challenge in terms of injecting them over the next summer to then reach comfortable 90 or 100% at the beginning of the heating season there. And storages are not only one thing to solve the situation. So other measures would be needed especially if winter would be cold, if Russia would still stop sending gas at all to Europe. Magdalena, you asked about the if Europe still is in a need of Russian gas. Most of the cases we would be able to just basically not use it at all, but in some specific cases, especially countries on the southern part of Europe would be in a need to use it, or go further with the demand response or be, I would say, looking for attracting additional LNG supplies that then could be limited by the infrastructure. Thank you.
Thank you, Kasper. So, Ben, do you agree with Kasper that the EU may not need Russian gas supplies at all during this winter? And do you agree with the deadline of the EU for the stopping of Russian gas supplies, both LNG and pipeline, which is 2027? Do you think that the whole EU could reach the year of independency of Russian gas supplies before it? And do you really think that there should be some exemptions for some countries, like it is in the case of crude oil, for example?
To quickly begin on the report, it's very nice. I enjoyed reading it and agree with all the main messages. And I would also encourage the audience to look into the report, because beyond what Kasper reported, there's lots of figures and graphs in there, complex ones comparing the correlation of gas hub prices and German temperature. It's really a lot of data in there, and I found it really interesting. Very quickly on the report and on the presentation, one point that came to my mind, which also raised, is Southeast Europe. And I saw on your infrastructure constraints, at least from my brief look at the map, between Spain and France, France and Germany, this part of Europe, it looked like there was lots of lines where you raise attention. But to me, which also links into your question, Magdalena, Southeast Europe is the risk. I mean, that's where Ukraine gas transit stream are coming into, which are the two remaining pipeline flows from Russia. And to my mind, I would not see a huge impact on Germany and other countries if these were stopped. I think the German energy ministry has made statements saying they're very concerned about this because they're worried about the need to pass more gas down south if it happens. But to me, the real risk seems in this area, and so I'd be interested in the kind of infrastructure constraints upon there. In terms of Europe's attempts to get away from Russian gas, I think we can certainly be more ambitious and do it before 2027. Concerning pipeline gas, at least at Bruegel, we published quite a few reports since the invasion outlining ways that Europe could end all Russian pipeline gas. And as we've seen over the last 12 months, it's not easy. We've already ended 2/3 of Russian pipeline gas, not really by choice, but mostly imposed by Russia, not in the Polish case, but in other cases. And with high prices, demand reduction, certainly with some economic pain, we got through it. And also, I would say with less economic pain than potentially was foreseen to begin with. So I think for the remaining pipeline flows, I would be quite confident Europe can adapt, even if Russia was to shut flows off tomorrow. And one big area that it leaves that I think is now becoming a big topic in political debate is Russian LNG, where since the beginning of the crisis, we haven't really discussed Russian LNG, largely because it's about 10% of pipeline flows, or historically it was around this level. So it's not as significant at all as pipeline flows. But it's increased. Again, as the report points out, Russian LNG has increased as Europe as a whole has turned to the global LNG market. We've also imported more Russian LNG. And now at the European level and at national level in countries such as Netherlands and Spain, who import lots of Russian LNG, there are now discussions on how to phase this out. And again, at Bruegel, we also work on a report looking at this. And again, our conclusion is that it would be even more so in the case of LNG, because you haven't got this same issue of pipelines which end in a certain point and the difficulty of getting capacity there or getting volumes there. With LNG, you go on the global market and you try to replace Russian cargoes with US or Qatar cargoes. So our sense is, again, that on Russian LNG, it would be possible also for Europe to end this. So in short, I think the EU can be much more ambitious than the 2027 target. And the progress we've seen so far is more ambitious. We've reduced a large share of Russian gas flows in the first year after the crisis, and there's still 4 years until 2027.
Thank you, Ben. I would like to stay longer with you. Indeed, it's very disturbing that we are reducing supply of Russian pipeline gas, but some countries, like you mentioned, the Netherlands, Spain, and France, they are increasing the LNG import from Russia. But I'm thinking whether LNG and Europe's reliance on the LNG spot purchases is maybe a danger to Europe, because Europe is now was never so much exposed to global LNG markets. Do you think that this is a threat to become so much more dependent, for example, on the US LNG supplies?
I think it's definitely a threat. So we've shifted in the crisis from, in the immediate aftermath of cuts to Russian pipeline flows, we didn't have the capacity. We couldn't get LNG into Northwest Europe, and that was the big challenge. We've seen rapid deployment of floating LNG terminals in Northwest Europe, which has largely alleviated this problem. And now we have capacity, not everywhere, but in many cases where we didn't before, for importing LNG. The next challenge then is finding the LNG on international markets. And so far, the situation has not been so tight with Europe. I mean, Europe has outcompeted Asia. We are fortunate that the US has a lot of spot capacity, as you say. But moving forward, it's certainly a risk to my mind that Europe needs to evaluate, is how dependent you want to be on the spot LNG markets and on America. I mean, there were discussions in America during the crisis of limiting LNG exports. I think they never really came to real political discussion, but it was certainly raised. I think this idea that if we cut LNG exports, we could lower domestic prices, which would have been catastrophic for Europe. So I think it's a risk. I don't think it's comparable to the risk that we were living anyway of being dependent on Russia. Again, for the point that LNG is a global market, and there is, in spite of historically long-term contracts, there are still significant cargoes today with spotability and with flexible destinations, which means that, in the case of disruption to one supplier, Europe should be able to look elsewhere. So a risk not comparable to Russia. And again, America is the big one, where I think it's about somewhere between 40 and 50% of LNG at the moment is coming from the States, which is a very large share for one supplier, albeit it's America, who should be our ally. But that's probably something that I would suggest should be looked at and should be considered in looking forward to the next 2-3 years of European gas, especially if we're going to become more and more dependent on LNG, and especially where lots of the new supply coming online in the next 2 or 3 years will be from America. In America, they're building lots more liquefaction projects, and Europe, if we completely phase out Russian gas, might end up being the destination for those. So you might see the share of American LNG even increase further.
Okay. Kamil, I wanted to ask you the question about the bottlenecks of EU gas infrastructure, because you briefly mentioned them during the presentation, but if you could elaborate more on this topic, where you identified these bottlenecks in gas infrastructure, meaning which countries are the most vulnerable for the possibly upcoming crisis during the winter.
Gladly. Basically, the most important flux in of gas, the flow of gas in our simulations was from Spanish LNG terminals to other Western European countries, and that basically was a most important limit. And that limitation of French-Spanish interconnection was challenged several times in last year. However, basically, as we've observed recently, it won't be resolved most probably by the natural gas investments, but investments in hydrogen pipelines. So H2 Med pipeline that would establish a connection from Portugal to Spain, from Barcelona to Marseille, then from France to Germany. So it would be important project of common interest. Like it's only obviously the on them. It's still in making on the matter of establishing its legal boundaries, but it would be a potential opportunity for Western Europe and for GAS7 in general to challenge most important boundary that will address, like, basically it would be around 60 70 terawatts if I remember well of energy. It would be hydrogen, and it will be by 2030, so a bit late, I would say. So working on some ways to increase the capacity of Spanish-French interconnection is most essential and most, I think, difficult. One of the potential opportunities is, and it already happened thanks to market, obviously, the increased transfers of electricity. So the gas-fired power plants can generate in Spain, can generate electricity and transfer it to France, to Italy, to Germany, to avoid the same, quite very same generation in gas-fired power plants in that countries. So that's one basic constraint. One of the constraints was addressed during the crisis, the French-German interconnection, but also, like, its capacity is quite limited, and it resulted in quite a big spread as we remembered last year, between PEG and TTF and PEG and THE prices. So the German price area was a bit more like about, if I remember well, 20% more expensive at some point than French pricing area. It decreased with the prices, but we cannot exclude that in times in more tense, in higher demand, for example, during the cold spell, it would return. So that's one of the issue, and it can be, to some extent, avoided by increasing the capacities or increasing the use of existing capacities between France, Belgium, and Belgium, Germany, Belgium, Netherlands, Germany. Also, one of the aspects that we try to address in our report is the limitation related to lack of a French-Italy interconnection. And it can be bypassed by transfers, potential some transfers through Switzerland, through Germany and Austria. However, it makes the Switzerland extremely important partner for GAS7 countries for potential cooperation. And the cooperation with Swiss partners will remain very important. Another thing with those bottlenecks is that Europe is becoming increasingly not only dependent on US LNG imports, but also on Norwegian continental shelf. And the competition on that shelf, not only within the GAS7 countries, but also with the United Kingdom. And the intense acquisitions of British Petroleum on Norwegian continental shelf last year quite prove that we need to cooperate, and the harsh competition, it does not benefit the GAS7 countries. So the cooperation with United Kingdom, cooperation with Switzerland is one of the important aspects to avoid the above mentioned bottlenecks.
Okay, so still there is a lot to do regarding the infrastructure extensions, let's say. But you mentioned the topic of hydrogen. That's why I wanted to ask Kacper about the prospects of hydrogen in the EU infrastructure, because for the first time ENTSOG introduced in its 10-year network development plan projects for developing of hydrogen infrastructure. There is a debate going on about hydrogen for a couple of years already, but usually the time when we think the hydrogen may be competitive and available is like at least 20 years from now. Could you say more? What role? What is the potential of hydrogen in stabilizing the energy market in Europe, and when do you think it could start replacing natural gas together with biomethane?
Thank you very much. That's really important to as well, I would say, touch this part of the prospects for the near future. So, in response to the crisis, Commission reacted in several ways. European Commission, and one of it was the Repower communication. In Repower communication, Commission expressed the willingness, I would say, for the member states and member states itself to be independent from Russian supplies. And it's supposed to be achieved with many different measures. And one of it mentioned its deployment, fast track deployment of the hydrogen economy in Europe as well. Ambitions set there are very high and very ambitious. So here we are talking about increase of the production in Europe up to 10 million tons of hydrogen and import, I would say more or less the same amount from outside of the EU. Saying that, we already know that it's 2023. It's not that distant future till 2030, because that's what I not mentioned, I think, is that those targets were set already for 2030. The aim is to replace natural gas demand and then to satisfy that demand with hydrogen, then being effectively reducing dependence on Russian fossils. Well, according to that, as you mentioned, ENSOC for the first time decided to develop its natural gas and hydrogen TONDP, where we are looking under different scenarios how future could look like, putting it against the projects that we collected. Many projects were collected. We have like very thorough and deep analysis in our TONDP, and all those projects are aiming to then allow to import of the hydrogen to Europe, and then I would say unleash the local potential to then being able to transfer it across the Europe to from where it could be produced to where it could be consumed, because now we see that renewable potential are located more on the south and north of the Europe, and then being able to use it as well in form of hydrogen would be beneficial for the rest of the Europe. What we know for sure is that Europe is having seasons, and seasonality then need to be covered not only in the closest future when we are talking about coming winter, but as well it will be a case for the future. Of course, role of gas and hydrogen will be different than it is now, and all of those aspects need to be taken into account. Kamil mentioned one of the projects, but there are actually many already submitted or thought through, and now Commission is as well taking into account those in the PCI selection process. So let's see what would be the first outcome of it and how exactly it will turn into reality. We are now seeing more and more concrete declaration on the production side, on the demand side. Infrastructure for that would be needed, especially taking into account, I would say, the different places where it could be produced, and then other areas that would be in demand of it. So in general, role of hydrogen should be increasing in the near future from the security of supply perspective to decrease dependence on Russian fossils as well, but at the same time not to decrease those decarbonization ambitions and carbon neutrality targets.
Well, thank you. Kamil also mentioned, and Kasper, you also related to the need of solidarity among the EU member states, or in case of our analysis, the GAS7 countries. And with certain assumptions of solidarity, meaning the common usage of national gas storage, the reduction needed of gas demand would be only 9%, which is less than it was during this winter. But I wanted to ask Ben, how do you think Europe could assure this solidarity? How to acquire the member states to, for example, to use commonly their national gas storages, or do you think it's at all good idea?
Thanks. If I may add 15 seconds on Casper's hydrogen, just to put these 2 by 10 million tons Repower EU targets into perspective, with the note that I find them too ambitious and unrealistic. Currently in the EU, consumption of hydrogen is 8 million tons of fossil hydrogen. It almost all comes from natural gas, 8 million tons. The target is by 2030, we produce ourselves 10 million tons of clean hydrogen. So that's all new, none of the old counts. And we import an extra 10 million tons. So the scale is, we more than double existing consumption, all being replaced. None of that counts. Build out the value chains, etc., etc. So it's very ambitious, and to my mind, potentially too ambitious, and we might rather focus elsewhere for some of these last few million tons. But that side, I could not resist. On the solidarity, I think Camille raised in his presentation the key message, which is let markets function. That was the challenge last winter, whether governments would step in and intervene with markets, which would have been very tempting to do so. And by and large, governments didn't do this and allowed them to function. And the story is we've for 15, 20 years built out joint European gas and electricity markets, and if you let them function, then they're designed to adapt to shocks. And we see high prices, which is hard to see, but that's the point of prices. Prices allocate scarce resources. They allocate also demand. That's what drove demand reduction, was ultimately prices. That's what drove LNG imports. I think President Biden liked to make the speech that he would, ensure US exported X million tons of LNG to Europe, but ultimately what did it was high prices. So the first message I would give to European leaders is, again, let markets function this coming winter to the greatest extent possible. And that has two angles. The most obvious is not intervening in a hard manner and closing interconnectors. So there was maybe some discussions with the UK and Netherlands, Belgium, which, post-Brexit would be a tighter one of actually just physically, in times of stress, closing these borders, which would be very damaging to the system. And fortunately, we didn't see this. But a softer area where I would argue governments didn't let markets function is subsidies. As yourself, if you're Germany or another country and you provide huge subsidies domestically to your consumers, you're weakening price signals and you're increasing domestic willingness to consume, and hence you're pulling gas in from elsewhere. And this in the worst way this ends up in is a race to the bottom. If we had a limited amount of gas in Europe, and again next winter we will still have capacity constraints, so we'll have a limited amount of gas. And if all countries again throw money and chase this limited amount of gas, it just gets passed around Europe, and prices go up, and nobody is better off apart from governments have to again put up billions of euros. So not closing borders, and to the greatest extent possible, not subsidizing, or if you're going to subsidize, doing it in a sensible manner. Again, to raise the example of Germany, in the end, their commission has arrived at the position where they have, I would say, a relatively smart subsidy scheme, which reduces the absolute cost of the first sort of 80% of consumption for a consumer or a household, which is seen as the inflexible consumption. That you're not really going to change your behavior for this 80%. That's a basic level of heating in your house, and the next 20% they still allow it to be exposed to market prices, meaning that you can still help consumers, but doing it in a way that allows market to function would be the biggest encouragement I offer. And a final point, which I also wanted to raise earlier and would be interested in other thoughts, is on the use of Ukrainian gas storage, where both panelists already have raised that this summer shouldn't really be an issue. Europe is going to reach the maximum capacity of its storages, which is about 100 BCM. And if we could click our fingers and have an extra 30 BCM storage, that would be great. We would like to use it. We can't really do that, but there is some BCMs, about 10 BCM, up to 30 actually, that could be available in Ukraine, and it's on the western side of Ukraine, near to Slovakia, and it's an area I think that needs exploration, which maybe, to my mind at least, would be interested in Camille and Casper's takes, but to my mind could provide extra resilience to Europe's gas grid ahead of next winter and prevent these potential arguments between countries over limited gas.
Yeah, it's interesting that you mentioned Ukraine and its potential to collaborate with Europe in terms of gas sector. It's not only, I guess, for the storage potential, but also for the production of mentioned hydrogen. And therefore, with Ukraine, we could reach this, as you said, too ambitious target of 10 million of tons of hydrogen production by 2030. But for this, I guess, situation in Ukraine has to be more stabilized. You also commented the protection of customers. In Bruegel, you've made estimations that EU countries spend more than 600 billions of euros for the protection of customers during energy crisis. Could you say that if, in your opinion, up to this point, this money were well spent, well directed? Was it necessary? Because what you said, and also this is the same thing that Kamil mentioned in his recommendation, that we shouldn't meddle so much in the market mechanisms, not to decrease the price signal for the customers to reduce their demand. Although in the other side, there is a huge pressure from business and also from society, huge expectations to have cheaper bills, which is also politically sensitive matter. So could you maybe give your opinion about the money spent until now, which was established in your analysis?
Thanks. I think until now, the money spent was generally poorly targeted, and you can design schemes which are better targeted and allow markets to function in a better manner. And I hope we do that going into this winter. Of course, politically, it was very difficult, and I understand why governments wanted to offer large subsidies, and also there was not so much time. I mean, governments had to push through plans very quickly through parliaments for subsidizing exposed energy consumers. But my criticism would be that often they acted on prices themselves and just artificially lowered prices for all consumers across the economy, which I don't think is the most sensible way to do this. I think you rather want to target these when it concerns households, the poorest 20, 30, 40, depending on how serious the situation is in your country, percentage of households, potentially with lump sum subsidies, rather than artificially lowering the price, such that to the greatest extent possible, you retain this marginal incentive to reduce demand, or this marginal incentive to transfer gas across borders. And again, I raised the example of Germany in my last answer, where I think the German debate has evolved more from initially being a flat subsidy and just lowering prices. Now, over time, they've arrived at this position where you can subsidize a chunk of gas consumption, which you argue is inflexible, but the 20 or 30%, which is potentially marginal, and households might be, or companies might be willing to reduce, you expose that to market signals. So I think moving forward, that's the challenge for governments, is to recognize that even today, or at least last week, prices were 40, 50 euros a megawatt hour. They're still 2-3 times higher than pre-crisis, and we still do have a challenge. But the challenge is that governments do this to the greatest extent possible while still allowing markets to function.
Thank you for your answer. And Kasper, what, in your opinion, are lessons learned from the past? I hope it's past energy crisis. And what do you think are recommendations for policy makers apart from what Ben said recently?
Thanks a lot. Actually, a few lessons learned were already mentioned in Kamil's report, which I think it's once again an invitation to jump into it. I will take an opportunity as well to invite to all the publications of NSOC around the topic. So one of the first thing is that, well, there is a need for smart way on looking on the infrastructure. Storages were mentioned several times in different contexts. As well, like not, I would say the voice to not too much intervene into market and to the situation. But when the crisis started, we realized that some storages, underground storages in Europe are Gazprom owned basically, and it was used as a weapon in Europe. So they were depleted in the season when it should be in, I would say, when the gas should be injected into them. Also providing, I would say, for the market signals and as well for the energy security of supply. Those things need to be then, I would say we need to take lessons from there. It shouldn't happen anymore, and we shouldn't just basically switch to dependence on somebody else or to keep it, I would say, still possibly harming us. Coordination and solidarity those are two things that can save Europe in, I would say, quite huge extent. So we see, and also in the scenarios that Kamil was investigating, in many cases countries are able to avoid of risk of demand curtailment if they are cooperating with themselves, and if not, countries are able to share the misery in a way that, well, protected customers still will be protected across the Europe. And that's why we need to talk to ourselves. That's what we do in NSOC as well. We are sitting our TSOs next to each other at the same table, discussing as well operational activities across the Europe. And that's what happened during the crisis. We were meeting every single day to discuss everyday situation, inventing solutions. I think coordination, cooperation need to be well communicated, and that way we would be able to avoid some, I would say, price panic attacks that then reflected, I would say, the gas prices were pumped in several times when actually there was it was no technical, I would say, a threat behind it. All of that, I would say, being independent from the supply from Russia, that should be still a goal, and we should perceive it. At the same time, decarbonization it shouldn't be forgotten in the future, and the targets, even if ambition, I would say, we could still aim that way, that direction, because well, future will come anyway. Whether we'll be prepared or not for that, that's the question.
Well, thank you. I don't see any questions from the audience, but I just have two issues that I still wanted to raise, and I wanted to ask Kamil about the relation of gas market with electricity market. What do you think will be the impact the coming winter of gas market on the electricity market, and further on, if you could say on the role of the gas in the transformation of the sector? Do you think it will decrease or increase? You may also, I'm talking to all the panelists, refer to any comments made by previous speakers.
Yeah, I would like to add on what Ben said a bit about efficiency of those subsidies. So, like, as Bruegel estimated, it was over 600 billions of euros. And if half of that would have been spent on energy efficiency, I think it would be more efficient and more promising way to use that extreme amount of money. And I'm afraid that subsidies are not only are political in two aspects. Firstly, they are expression of fear that people are afraid how society would react to problems with our affordability of gas. But it's also second, or often unexpressed, it's a hope. And the subsidies are the hope that we will return to business as usual. And I think there is no way to go back, and it's the opinion not only of Polish Economic Institute, it's the opinion of European Commission. There is no way to go back to business as usual. So if there is no coming back to business as usual, to old imports from Russia, the most realistic aspect is not the most realistic approach is not to subsidize, is to adapt as fast technically and economically as fast as possible to the change, and not to mitigate it. So, like that being said, the impact of in Central and Eastern Europe, the impact and correlation between energy and gas market, unfortunately, I'm afraid is going to increase in short term, because many countries like Poland have to phase out the coal power plants to achieve the transition goal. And the amount, even in Polish economic policy 2040 and its adaptation to current situation, the amount of gas consumed in critical gas-fired power plants is going to increase. So that will it's going to increase by about 60, 70, about 40, about 70 terawatt hours. So by 2030. So it remains for small countries such as Poland, it will signify the increasing importance of gas-fired power plants. However, the deployment of renewables will, to some extent, mitigate that influence. On the other hand, the transition of electricity and the potential cascade effects of the crisis in the gas market will become increasingly important, and can be also observed in correlation, especially not in prices in general, but the peak prices. So if something's happening, if something especially is happening with the infrastructure that we listed, the colorful one in our table, it will be very probable that something also, like they will expect a higher peaks on the gas market as well.
Okay, thank you, Kamil. I will have the last question to Ben, but any other panelist may reply as well, and you will have the last couple of minutes to give your opinion on the topics that we were discussing. But Ben, we didn't mention during our discussion the platform for the common EU purchases of natural gas. What is your opinion about this solution? Is it effective? If not, how to make it effective? Is it helpful, necessary?
Just to say the expression of fear and hope for subsidies, I really like this. It's a nice way of putting it. And I think particularly on the hope side, that's somewhere where Europe needs to have a deep think. I mean, something like the ammonia industry, to what extent do you balance subsidies of gas getting into this chemical sector, and to what extent you aggressively roll out, for example, hydrogen to decarbonize it? Again, at the household level, heat pumps. I think Poland was perhaps the most impressive European country last year in terms of scaling up the residential heat pump sector. Again, to what extent do you use your subsidies for artificially lowering current gas prices, and to what extent do you say, especially in Eastern Europe, the future of Russian gas is ended and we can build our LNG capacity, which will help, but ultimately we're unlikely ever to go back to the days of abundantly cheap gas, and we need to, rapidly decouple. On the energy platform, so this is the energy platform launched by the European Commission, which aims to coordinate purchases of gas at the European level and then go on international markets and kind of and purchase this gas. I mean, so far they've had their first round of bids, and I think around 10 BCM of supply is the number they got to, which is a significant amount. And they haven't released much more information on exactly how it works that I've seen, at least. Casper might know more. But to my mind, that seemed to work. The first round of tender, they got a lot of interest. One peculiarity I noted was that about 80% of the supply was pipeline, where to my mind, I always understood the energy platform as being a tool for coordinating purchasing LNG on international markets and bringing that into places that never before had an LNG contract because they had Russian gas. And if you're signing pipeline gas, does that mean you're negotiating with Norway? Or I wasn't really sure how that works. So that's one peculiarity I noted. Yeah, and I had one other point on it, but it's gone. I'll quickly shout it if I remember it. But thanks.
Maybe Casper wants to relate to what Ben said, and then Ben can use the time to try to recollect what was the last point he wanted to say. Do you have, Casper, any comment on the EU platform?
Yeah, sure. So maybe not exactly about the results itself, because as Ben said, what was communicated so far, it is more or less the amount of purchase and that the demand was satisfied. I think we can find as well in the media is that some Ukrainian demand was as well satisfied during that purchase, which I think it's a useful then, and I think we can call it a success, I would say, if it fulfills the purpose. I'm not aware about whether it's through pipelines or LNG. I was not aware of that, but nevertheless, yeah, let's say if somebody wants to use it, then it's okay. I think it's then perfectly fine. I want to refer to one point made by Ben regarding Ukrainian storages. That's really interesting because indeed, not far from the Polish border, there are storages that then could be heavily used. And as we can see already this summer, ambitions for storing the gas would be probably reached without any specific additional effort. And then why to not use maybe a little bit more of that? Of course, the question is known who's going to ensure that, or whether market companies will be willing to take a risk of using those storages. I think from the transmission system perspective, it would be definitely good to have additional gas being stored for the next winter, and if that's a possibility, why to not try to use it?
Okay, so on this note, I think we will finish our debate. We have no questions from the audience. I would like to anyway thank you so much, dear audience, for listening to our discussion. And the most, I would like to thank our panelists, Ben and Casper, for joining us, for giving your time to meet with us. And I want to thank Kamil for providing your presentation and very, very interesting work that you did in your report. And of course, I encourage all of our listeners to dig deeper in the analysis of Polish Economic Institute. Thank you so much for your time, and hope to see you again during the next debate of the Polish Economic Institute. Goodbye.
Thank you.
Thank you.